kids could come down and, I'd like to thank the faculty and our staff and students for being here today. Today is a very important day for our law school, and especially for me. We're here today to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And not only that, to also celebrate his accomplishments. I was fortunate enough to be part of the civil rights movement, and I had an opportunity to meet Dr. King and be a part of this great movement. And through that, I met two great men, Jose Williams and John Lewis. Jose is no longer with us. Some of you all might know him. He lived in Atlanta. But today I dedicate our celebration to John Robert Lewis, Congressman for the 5th Congressional District of Georgia, United States Congress, one of the greatest leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement. Some of you all might know that he is fighting for his life. He has cancer. But he said he's battled a lot and had to fight a lot of battles. And so today, we will honor him, but we also will send good vibes to him. With that in mind, I'd like to welcome everyone here today. And I know that a lot of you all know me. I'm Shirley Jefferson. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Affairs and Diversity, but also an alumni of this great school. How many of you high school kids, first time coming to this law school, raise your hands? Oh, well, that's good. Then a lot of you have already been here. Great. Well, what we are going to do today, we're going to follow the order of our program. And for some of you who might not know, the African Americans have an anthem that we sing. If you look at the words, it talks about the struggles and the hard time that we had encountered here in this country. But those words and struggle can also apply to you. So what we're going to do is we're going to stand, and I have a group of people here that we're going to lead you all in the African American National Anthem. And it's called Lift Every Voice and Sing. If you can't sing, just hum along.
Voice and sing till earth and heaven Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Vermont Law School. It's terrific to have our students from the Bethel and Royalton schools with us, so come back often and then come to school here. In a moment, after we have a little more music, we are going to have the Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court, Paul Reiber, who's a great friend of Vermont Law School, introduce our speaker, the Honorable Anna Blackburn-Rigsby, who's a talented and thoughtful person I had the pleasure of dinner with last night. And she's been up this morning to meet with the governor and the other members of the Vermont Supreme Court. We're so delighted to have her here with us. I just wanted to offer a few words of welcome and reminders about how special a day this is, and thank you for being with us. The first is, and some of you have heard this before, but for the students from the schools, I have a couple of very distant personal connections to Dr. King. The first is that I heard him speak in Central Park in 1967, shortly before he was tragically killed. And the crowd was so large in Central Park at the time, overflowing Sheep's Meadow, which is the largest part of Central Park, that I can't actually say that I heard anything that he said, but I felt moved at the age of 12 to see the incredible outpouring of support for Dr. King. That was a long time ago. Also, my dad, who is still alive, is exactly the same age as Dr. King would have been if he had not been so tragically shot down by an assassin's bullet in April of 1968. He'd be a part of our living history, not a part of our past. And that makes me think of how current Dr. King and his message is or should be for all of us. My father, who was a lawyer in a law firm in New York City at the time, was one of many northern lawyers who went in 1964 to the South to register black voters, allowed to be registered thanks to changes made to the Civil Rights Act. And the rumor that he's never actually confirmed is that he was beaten up in the courtroom for this activity by some locals who were opposed to this. But I'm sure if you knew my father that he landed a few good punches as well. But the fact that an African-American minister from Atlanta, only 35 years old at the time, inspired a white lawyer of the same age from New York City to leave his family for the summer. By the way, we spent the summer at a friend's house in Vermont, in Warren, Vermont, which I remember well, speaks volumes of the influence that Dr. Martin Luther King had on America and the fight for civil rights. When Dr. King died at the age of 39 in 1868, he's not that much older than a lot of you in the room, if I speak to our own law students. And he first attracted national attention in 1955 when he and other civil rights activists were arrested after leading a boycott of the Montgomery, Alabama bus system, which required non-whites to surrender their seats to whites and stand or sit at the back of the bus. That wasn't that long ago. That was 1955. That's the year I was born. Dr. Martin Luther King was 26 years old at the time that he led that boycott, younger than many of our students, and a sign of how much you may be able to accomplish with your own lives. I want to just quote a couple of things from Dr. King and then turn over the podium. I was also reminded that Dr. King did not limit his advocacy only to civil rights. Going against the advice of some of his colleagues, he spoke out against the Vietnam War in the 1960s at a time when few civil rights leaders did so. And he did that at the risk of his own reputation, but he felt strongly it was the right thing to do. He said, and I quote him, "There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must take it because his conscience tells him he is right." And I think that's one of the legacies that Dr. King leads to us. One of the most famous statements, including the I Have a Dream speech that Dr. King made, was that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. You've heard President Barack Obama use that quote a number of times, and actually Dr. King borrowed it from a 19th century minister. And I have always wanted to believe that while the arc of the moral universe, meaning the course of history, is long, that it bends towards justice. But a lot of people disagree and say that the arc is not bending towards justice. And if you were to read the Sunday New York Times, there was a long article about that. I have some quotes here about it, but in the interest of time, I will skip them and simply summarize and say, are we really making progress towards achieving justice and equality for everyone in the United States? And is it not our duty to do so? That's part of the duty that lawyers have. It's part of the duty that policymakers have. It's part of the duty that we have as educators. So I want to leave you with a thought from Michelle Alexander, author of a book called The New Jim Crow, published 10 years ago, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And she writes about the so-called inconvenient truth that racial progress in this country is always much more complex and frequently more illusory than it appears. While she concedes there's been some progress in the last 10 years, bipartisan support for prison downsizing and criminal justice reform, which I'm proud to say our own restorative justice program at this school is an example. She also points out that some measures, that some types of measures that resulted in the U.S. having the highest rates of incarceration in the developed world are now being used against the immigrant population. And I'm pleased that the opening of our new Burlington office to assist immigrants, provide legal assistance to immigrants, is designed to combat that. But she writes very eloquently, and I quote her in saying, "The centuries-long struggle to birth a truly inclusive, egalitarian democracy," by the way, for you students, it's what you read about in your junior year American history class, "a nation in which every voice and every life truly matters, did not begin with us, and it will not end with us. The struggle is as old as the nation itself, and the birth process has been painful. My hope and prayer is that we will serve as faithful midwives in our lifetimes and do what we can to make America finally what it must become." And I think it is the nation which Dr. King described as one in which his children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So I thank you so much for being here. I very much look forward to hearing from the judge, and I turn the podium back to Dean Jefferson.
Okay, we'll have a musical selection by Ricardo Edwards. And then we'll have Ariel. Is that?
Okay. But before I start the song is called Wade in the Water. Because many slaves knew the secret meaning of these songs. They could be used to signal many things. For example, Harriet Tubman used the song Wade in the Water to tell the escaping slaves to get off the trail and get into the water to make sure the dogs that slave catchers used couldn't sniff out their trail. People walking through water did not leave a scent trail that dogs could follow. So, give me 1 minute. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Who's that young girl dressed in red? Wade in the water. Must be the children that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Oh, wade in the water. Wade in the water. children wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Who's that young girl dressed in blue? Wade in the water. Must be the children coming through. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Ooh, 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 ooh. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Ooh. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children wade in the water. God's gonna trouble 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 the water. Thank you so much.
All right. Doing great. Good morning. All right. Whew. All right. To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, and to right the unrightable wrong, to love pure and chaste from afar, to try when your arms are too weary, to reach that unreachable star. This is my quest, to follow that star. No matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And I know if I'll only be true to this glorious quest, then my heart will lie peaceful and calm when I'm laid to my rest. And the world will be better for this, that one man scorned and covered with scars still strove with his last ounce of courage to dream the impossible dream and to reach the unreachable star.
Wow, feel like we're having church up in here. Wave in the water and to dream the impossible dream. Two powerful songs. Just listen at the words. I'm telling you, thank you both for such beautiful music. Next, we will have the Honorable Paul Reiber, Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court. How many of you all seen a Supreme Court justice before? High school kids, raise your hands. Well, today you could say that, and not only that, you're gonna see a chief judge too. I'm getting all fired up now. That's what I'm talking about.
I wish I could sing.
We'll put you on the program next year.
Yeah, no. Save your breath, Ariel. Don't worry about the stand coming apart. I popped a button this morning before I got here. So one of the things I like about the law. One of the things I like about this law school is the opportunity for new and positive relationships. People who I never knew before, people with ideas that I had never considered before, the opportunity to exchange thoughts and to get to know one another, even in situations where we may disagree. Part of the spirit of the law, I think, is to lay a foundation to have conversations with each other, maybe even very difficult conversations with each other, hard conversations with each other, where there are profound and tightly held beliefs about various issues from one side or the other. So this morning, as the Dean, as Dee McHenry mentioned, the Chief and I spent the whole morning visiting with members of the leadership in the House and Senate, well, I should say with the two judiciary committees and also with the governor. And Do you mind if I just take a few minutes before thank you, Dean. Thank you, Dean. This is I can't say enough, and Anna knows this, but I can't say how much I am so very grateful that she spent her time, took time away from her very, very busy schedule in the District of Columbia, where she's the chief judge, to not only be here, but to travel here in the middle of the winter on probably the coldest set of days we're going to have. This is going to be memorable, Anna, I know, for many different reasons, but I'm afraid that may be one of them, not one that I would have wished. So we met with the governor first thing this morning, and this is one of the great privileges of the job I've got. If you ask to see the governor, he typically is going to say yes, right? And so we had a private meeting with him, not that anybody was excluded from it. It was in a public space, but we had a nice chat with him. One of the things that we discussed is the fact that a couple of years ago, 2018, the legislature passed and the governor signed an act relating to promoting racial and ethnic fairness in the structures of government and the way in which government in Vermont works and operates. And under that act, one of the provisions is for the establishment of, and I think it's called an advisory council. I might have the words a little bit wrong, but I think that's what it's called. There are 5 members of the advisory council. I had an appointment to that. I appointed Judge Nancy Waples, who's one of our really fine judges who sits in Burlington a lot. And there were 4 other appointments from the House and Senate, and the governor had an appointment. And these folks, one of their major jobs was to hire a commissioner of racial and ethnic fairness. And they did that last summer. They hired a young woman from New York City whose name is Susanna Davis. And Susanna and I have had a few meetings. She's a terrific young woman. But here's what I wanted to tell you. The governor, at some point in our conversation, the 3 of us, where's Andrew? Andrew was there too. Our intern, one of your classmates, was with us too. He said, one of the things that she has done, that Susanna, and she's a young woman of color, one of the things that she has done, and I don't mean to say that's the only reason, but she has, he said, made it easier to have the hard conversations. I thought that was really great. I thought that was really, really great. Because I think when we talk about race, and one of the things we should be, in my mind, most mindful of about the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is the legacy of communication that he brought to his service to this country. The legacy of communication in nonviolent ways, of making a peace through nonviolent efforts to communicate with the opposing, very, very rigidly opposing points of view that he faced then. And indeed, we all know that there are opposing views that are very strong even today. So I come back to my original theme, which is one of the things I like about this school, one of the things I like about the practice of law, the discipline of law, one of the things I like about this ceremony here today is the opportunity for us to talk, the opportunity for us to encourage each other, to embrace, our better angels, to hope for the best for each other, and to look for the best in each other. And somebody who exemplifies this, who has been my friend, and I hope will still be my friend after she gets home, is Chief Judge Anna Blackburne-Rigsby. The chief is the Chief Judge of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, which is the highest appellate court for the District of Columbia. As Chief Judge, she chairs the Joint Committee on Judicial Administration for the District of Columbia Court System. The chief was appointed to the Superior Court, listen to this, by Bill Clinton, and later appointed to her seat on the Court of Appeals by George Bush. Wow, how about that? How about that? You get it? You see what I'm saying? Huh? I mean, this is the personification of what I'm talking about. She's been on the bench for more than 20 years. When she was an associate judge, she chaired the District of Columbia Court's Standing Committee on Fairness and Access on the District of Columbia's Access to Justice Commission. She currently serves on the Board of Directors for the National Consortium on Racial and Ethnic Fairness in the Courts. She's been vocal about the importance of diversity and public trust in the judiciary. She chairs the Community Engagement in State Courts initiative. Her husband is a judge. She's married to Robert Rigsby, Associate Judge of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. And oh, by the way, she's won one or two awards. Business and Professional Women's League Sojourner Truth Award, the Women's Bar Association of the District of Columbia Star of the Bar Award, the National Bar Association Herman Sweat Champion of Justice Award, and the Greater Washington Area Women Lawyers Division Charlotte E. Ray Award. Please join me in welcoming Chief Judge Anna Blackburne-Rigsby.
Well, hello, Vermont Law School, and hello to the students of White River High School. Where are you? All right, stand up. Let me see all the students from White River High School. Go ahead, stand up. You just waved to me a minute ago. Stand up. Wow. Wow. That's amazing. I am so honored that you all came out this afternoon. Where are the students from Vermont Law School? Can you all, as we say, wave your hands in the air, wave them like you really care. And I understand we also have some Masters of Law students here. Where are you all? I see. Wow. Well, I'm just so honored that you all invited me here, and I have to start by saying a very, very, very special thank you to someone who I can see is so special to all of you here, and that is Dean Shirley Jefferson. And so will you all join me in giving her a special... I've had an opportunity to get reacquainted with Dean Jefferson because she spent a good part of her professional career practicing law and working in local politics as chief of staff to one of our senior council members on the District of Columbia City Council, and practicing in our local courts. And so you just never know when you're going to cross paths with a wonderful, wonderful person who changes lives every day. When I look around the school, she picked me up from the airport yesterday, and I swear every 2 steps somebody was going, Shirley? Or Dean Jefferson? Or one of her students called on the phone. I'm not saying who it was. Ariel. Where's Ariel? It wasn't Ariel. But it just goes to show you that with a good heart, a heart of love, and a mindset on doing the right thing and
doing and seeking justice, what an impact you can make. Chief Justice Reiber, my friend, and I say that you never know who will be your friend and where you'll share a common interest with someone. And we had the opportunity to meet and work together in the Conference of Chief Justices. It sounds like perhaps a stuffy, stodgy group. Maybe sometimes it is, but not with Chief Justice Reiber. He keeps it real, he's warm, he's genuine, and he welcomed me as a junior chief judge when I joined the organization. And we sit on committees together, and one of the committees is the committee that I chair. And what he didn't tell you is he is the chief of the chiefs. So he served as the chief judge of the chief judges of all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And so he's a very, very special friend of this law school and friend to me. So thank you for inviting me. And to Dean McHenry, it was a pleasure to meet you and your lovely wife yesterday for dinner. A really great dinner, too, at the Norwich Inn. And your experience in environmental law and your connection to this law school, even before you became the dean, I think is something that's very, very special to us all. And I had a chance to meet some students. You're a student president, Ray, and Ariel, and where's Mariana? I didn't see. Oh, there you go. And so I just feel very welcome, and it really helped this morning, I have to say, when I woke up at 5:30 this morning, and I looked at my weather app on my phone. I can say that because my son, who's 22, showed me how to add an app to my phone. And I had to shake the phone. I said, I know it's early, but does this say -1? What is that? So I'm happy to be here. I thawed out on the way here, and I just can't tell you what a special honor this is to share with you. And I thought I would spend a few minutes just sharing a few thoughts, and then Dean Jefferson and I are going to sit in these two chairs, and she's going to ask me questions, and I really hope that some of you will ask questions, because I really would love to just have a dialogue today and talk to you. As my son likes to say, can we get real, Mom? I want you to just listen to me. And usually that means he's getting ready to drop a huge bombshell on me. But I want to just start with a few reflections on your theme today, which is out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope. And I don't know if you all know where that comes from. It's one of the quotes that was a part of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963, August of 1963, on the National Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And if you look on the beautiful programs that have been prepared, you see the depiction of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, which is in Washington, D.C. And the artist, the sculptor, literally carved the picture of Dr. King out of this mountain of stone. If you go to the memorial, it literally is a big block of stone. And it just struck me when I thought about that. If you all were singing the words of Lift Every Voice and Sing, which may be an unfamiliar song to some people, but it's a mix of despair, stony the road we trod, walking over the trails of the blood of the slaughtered, and also a lot of hope, that we still are lifting our voices and we're singing and we're hopeful because we know that we are going forward no matter what. And I guess that's part of the message that I have for all of you. I actually can remember very vividly a couple of things. I remember the day that Dr. King was assassinated, and I would have been 7 years old at the time. And this will take you back through a time capsule to some of our students. We had one black and white television in the living room, and so everybody would watch TV together. Now you can imagine what it's like to watch TV and only be able to watch it with your parents and only be able to watch what they wanted to watch. And it was black and white, and it had these rabbit ear antennas, And you actually had to get up and change the channel. And there were only like 3 or 4 channels. But on every single one of the channels, in grainy black and white, were just pictures of people crying and sadness and people literally wailing in the streets. And I remember, my parents, what was scary to me was my parents were crying. And, that was, what is going on? That is so tragic. And then there was silence. I have 2 sisters, and we had a dog and a cat and bird and probably other creatures. It was never silent in our house. And it was silent and grim. And I just kept thinking, why are they all so sad? And what does assassination mean? I didn't understand what that meant. And then they explained, somebody shot Dr. Martin Luther King. And if you can imagine, all that we knew as children about his message was that it was a message of love and peace and people getting together and living as one in harmony. And all I could think of is, if someone would shoot and kill him, then none of us are safe. And that was just a scary period. And so when I tell you that is sort of so much a part of my life and who I am and why I chose the path that I did. My parents were always, from the time I can remember, involved in the civil rights movement. My mother was born in North Carolina during segregation, legal segregation. And, I want to stress, since we're at a law school, why the law is so important. Because you have to remember, we talk so much about love and can't we all get along, that we forget that racism and discrimination was not just a feeling. It wasn't, I don't like black people, or I don't like brown people, or I don't like Catholic people, I don't like Jewish people. That's not what it was about. It was about the fact that the law treated people differently because of their race. And different wasn't better. Different meant that my parents could not go to a drive-in movie theater 5 minutes outside of Washington, D.C., because it was a whites-only drive-in movie theater. A drive-in. Who are you going to see in a drive-in theater? You're in your own car. But you couldn't do that. My mother remembers very vividly that she couldn't go shopping in a store and try on the clothes. She had to use the colored water fountain. And if you could imagine a nice, shiny, porcelain white water fountain that said whites only, and then a cruddy, rusty, corroded, dirty fountain with brown water coming out of it, right next to it that said colored only. And if you drank out of the white water fountain, you could get arrested and go to jail. You couldn't ride on the front of the bus. You couldn't travel to certain places. You couldn't stay in hotels. You couldn't go to certain schools. You couldn't go to colleges. We're talking about laws that dictated every aspect of your life if you were born black in America. And so in 1955, when Dr. King first started the Montgomery bus boycott at 26, I think Dean McHenry said, what was happening? He put it all on the line because risking imprisonment, risking lynchings, risking violence to change the laws in this country, to make it possible for blacks and whites and people of all races to be treated equally so that they could get to a place where they could actually be brothers and sisters and see our country's promise of democracy fulfilled. And so when I think of I can never remember a time when I didn't want to be a lawyer, because I'm growing up in a community where my mom, her family ultimately migrated from North Carolina to Ohio, and then she moved to New York City and met my dad. Now, my dad's family, a different story of different kinds of struggle. My grandfather was born in Jamaica in the Caribbean and immigrated to this country with nothing, he talks about. He used to work on the ships that would bring bananas up from the Caribbean all the way up the eastern seaboard. And he said he got called all kinds of awful names. monkey chaser, all kinds of derogatory names because he was an immigrant. But he worked, he started driving a taxi and ultimately bought his own taxi cab company. And so his story to all of his grandchildren and his children was the importance of education and serving and giving back. And so my parents would, as my sisters and I felt at the time, drag us to every community meeting, rally, conference. Has anyone ever heard of the NAACP? And so they have local chapters in pretty much every state, and they had a youth council. And so my sisters and I, when we were in high school, were a part of the youth council, and we would organize voter registration drives, and we would organize visits to see our school board. So my parents were getting us to be engaged, and they used to always tell us that to those whom much is given, much is expected in return. And when I say much, we didn't have much. We weren't rich by any standard. But we were always told that if you worked hard, that you served in your community, that you tried to make whatever space you occupied better than when you left, that you were doing the right thing, and that you could do it at any age. And so I'm so glad to see so many of our high school students here, because I don't want you to think, oh, when I'm 30 and I'm old, that's not old, then I'll do X, Y, and Z. Or, the law students, I don't want you to think that, oh, after I graduate, after I take the bar, after I make some money, then I'll do. I want you to start thinking about the power of now and the urgency of now, that no one else can do what you can do. You're unique, you each have unique gifts, and we can't all do everything, but we can all do something, whether that's smiling at your neighbor. If you're not eligible to vote, whether it's driving your car and taking somebody else who can. And while I'm talking about voting, I can't tell you who to vote for because judges are nonpartisan. And I am very proud of the fact that I was appointed by both a Democratic president and a Republican president, because I like to think that means I'm a fair and impartial judge. But what I will say is that knowing what I know about my mother and her brothers and sisters and her parents who could not vote because it was against the law for them to vote because they were black in this country. Knowing what I know about John Lewis, who was beaten and lived with an injury his whole life because he tried to fight for the rights of blacks in Alabama and throughout the South to be able to exercise their rights as citizens and vote. It is unconscionable to me that anyone who has the right to vote and the age to vote is not registered to vote. I don't care who you vote for, but every election matters. Your county justice of the peace, your school board president, your county council person, your governor, every election matters. And so how many of you are old enough to vote? 18. Good. So if you're voting for the first time or the second time, no, you got to vote because it is critical. It impacts everything that you do. Now I lost track of what I was talking about. I think maybe this is a good time to stop and
You've already answered all
take some take some.
What I think we're gonna do, you and I are gonna sit in these two chairs over here, and I think Dean Ruslow or Teresa will pass around the mic. You answered every question that I had. Oh, okay. And what I do want to do, because I want to get to the questions, because they have to get back to class at 2. Questions. Why don't we start with some of those?
All right, we got one right here.
Great.
Chief Judge, thank you for being here. You get to come up to Vermont and have a little bit of an outside perspective, and I know that you would not have possibly had the time to do some great investigation, but you've had conversations with the legislature, with the governor. What do you see are some of the challenges for our legal system, our justice system here in Vermont that might be different from what you see in DC that might be particular to Vermont?
Oh, okay, great question. What do I see as some of the challenges in Vermont's legal system that might be different from the District of Columbia? Let me start by saying I see far more similarities than I do differences. For those of you who may not know this, state court systems like your Vermont State Court and like our District of Columbia local court system, the state courts see and hear cases in over 95% of the cases. So that means 95% of the people who ever have to go to a court go to a state court. The federal courts are courts of what we call limited jurisdiction. They hear limited kinds of cases, important cases. So we see volumes. We are the people's court in the states. We see the concerns that are near and dear to people's heart: child custody, criminal justice, civil disputes between people, landlord-tenant cases, probate cases. So those things are similar. I think the biggest difference I see, Vermont and the Washington, D.C., population-wise, are very close. Washington, D.C. has just barely 700,000 people, and Vermont has 625, 35,000 people. But D.C. is completely an urban jurisdiction. There is no countryside or suburb unless you go down to the National Mall area. And that has issues. One of the biggest differences I see is that Vermont is much more of a rural jurisdiction, and so in some ways there's more isolation in terms of pockets of people who are isolated. On the other hand, I see a lot more local civic and community engagement in these small towns and communities throughout the state that I admire. I think in Washington, D.C., we just got what we call home rule, local control of our local government in 1976. So it's a new government in many ways. And the district used to be governed by federally appointed commissioners, and local residents had no say in schools, in any of the things that you all do on a daily basis. And so getting people engaged is a challenge there. Here, people are engaged in your local communities because you do everything, and I think that's special. That means there are opportunities when you're in high school to go down to the, what do you call it, the county town hall, and just tell them what you think. That's important, and so I think that's an opportunity. I think other challenges are people don't know what courts do. And I think when I was in school, civics education was a part of our curriculum, and you understood there were 3 branches of government. They have 3 different kinds of power. They are all equal. They serve as checks and balances against each other so that no one center of power takes over everything. I think people are forgetting that or never learning it, and it's a problem. Other differences, I think, the opioid crisis has hit Vermont and many other states much harder than it's hit Washington, D.C. On the other hand, in the late 80s, early 90s, we had the crack cocaine epidemic. The good thing is I feel people have learned from the tragedy of the 80s because now they treat substance abuse as an illness as opposed to a crime. It's now 2020. We still have young men and women locked up in the District of Columbia system for being crack addicts. The sentences were long. The belief was that you punish. And frankly, underlying that policy was some racial injustice. And so those are just a few of the differences. And while I will say when we're talking about hope, I'm hopeful because I shared with Justice Reiber and Dean McHenry, our court building, the historic courthouse where my office is and where our Court of Appeals is is a historic building in Washington, D.C., and it was a seat of government, and it served as a federal courthouse before it was our local courthouse. But in the pre-Civil War era, it also, while functioning as a courthouse, served as a central point where fugitive slaves were rounded up and sold back into slavery, and where slave auctions took place. Now, if you kind of think about that, and then on my tough days at work, I like to think about that and say, if you never had hope, I have hope. Because 100 years ago, there's no way I would be doing the job I'm doing, in the building I'm doing it, as the chief. And so I see progress. On the other hand, the poverty rate in Washington, D.C. is higher than it was in 1968. The rate of incarceration of African Americans is twice as high as it was in 1968, and 7 times higher than the rate of incarceration of white Americans. And so while we've made a lot of strides, and we continue to do that, the legalized segregation has largely been dismantled. There are still areas that are of great concern, and one is the criminal justice system.
Let us hear from the high school students. I know you all have some questions. Don't be shy. Walk around Teresa over there and see if you could stir him up some. Oh, no.
Can I ask how many of you are seniors in high school? Are any of you seniors?
Oh, that's a lot. That's a lot.
What are you thinking? Any thoughts on what you'd like to do after graduation?
Boy, we got our work cut out, Vermont Law School. We better get on down the road to the school.
We got a question over here.
Oh, good. Great. All right, you high school kids, think about your next question, okay?
Well, first, thank you for coming this way. It's always great to see a black face, or another black face, in Vermont.
Fred, wait a minute now. In the room, in Vermont.
In the room, in the state, in the town, anywhere up here in northeastern Vermont. Like in northern New England. But my question really has to do with the issue of the overwhelming number of complaints filed against black lawyers. The ethics commissions report overwhelmingly that black lawyers are overreported about their ethical violations.
In the state, or just generally?
Generally. And my question is, what do you think that we should do to help remedy that problem? As that seems to be one of the practice problems that a lot of black lawyers have.
Well, let me just answer that in a couple ways. One, the legal profession, we pride ourselves on trying to make sure that lawyers practice in an ethical way. And in order to become a lawyer, I don't know if everybody, some of our students from White River may not know this. In order to become a lawyer, not only do you have to go to law school in most instances and pass the bar exam, which is like the SAT on steroids, I call it. But once you pass the bar exam, you could pass the bar exam and still not be admitted to practice as a lawyer.
That's right.
Because you have to.
I tell them we have a character and fitness a couple of weeks from now.
Character and fitness, and that's
Yes.
because members of the legal profession are deemed to uphold the highest values and ethical standards. And so when I hear stories about unethical lawyers or lawyers who have practiced in an unethical way, it concerns me because lawyers have a great responsibility. And the court and judges, we trust lawyers. If you're a lawyer, you're considered what we call an officer of the court. If you watch some of these television legal dramas. So as an officer of the court, if you say something to the judge is assuming that it's true. We don't put lawyers under oath, generally, like we do a witness. We ask a lawyer, counsel, is that correct? And because we trust your character. So that's a lot of responsibility. What I find as the highest court, and Chief Justice Reiber knows this as well, we are responsible for admitting lawyers to practice and making sure that they practice in an ethical way. I find that a number of lawyers who run into ethical issues, it's generally because they are solo practitioners often, and they're practicing in an isolated way. And the law is the kind of profession where you need each other. You need to talk to people. You need to be lifelong learners so that you stay current. I mean, would you want to go to a doctor's appointment with a doctor who's still doing surgery the same way they did it in 1950? No. Would you want to go to a lawyer who's still representing cases that are no longer the current state of the law? And when you are in solo practice trying to get clients and keep clients and pay bills, it's a little harder than if you practice in a firm where you could talk to other lawyers. So that's the number one cause I see for what we call ethical violations. A lot of them are not because they did something sort of sleazy and underhanded. It's usually because they let something fall through the cracks. They forgot to call a client back, they missed a deadline, they didn't properly account for the money of clients.
Money.
That's a big issue. It's a big
Yep.
issue. So I think practice, we have a service with our bar that helps lawyers who are starting to just be overwhelmed have a practice management class that will help them better organize their practice. Those are the lawyers I care most about. The ones who commit gross ethical violations like lying under oath, lying to the court, I don't have any sympathy for them. So I'll stop there.
Yep, but you know, I was gonna say, I remember when I was practicing law, one of the things that you hit on was that the attorney failed to communicate with their clients, and they would keep calling and wouldn't get an update. I almost say that's some of our students who would be trying to get in touch with, and they fail to communicate with us. And I'll say to you young high schoolers, I hope when the principal call you all to the office that you all go, or you communicate. That's the failure. That's one of the big, and money. I watched a lawyer in my office get disbarred.
Because of money.
That's right, for money. He wanted to have a fancy car and a fancy house, and he was living above his means, and so he decided that he was going to commingle the funds.
That's a problem.
That's a problem. But I was going to also say, you know, since President Obama was elected, they said that we're in a post-racial era. Do you believe that, or what is your thoughts on that?
I think we have taken our eyes off the prize. I call it our foot off the pedal, and not paid attention to the important legal gains of eliminating laws that created inequality and injustice. And as a result, we're losing ground. And now one area, for example, is voting rights. How many of you ever heard of the Voting Rights Act, 1960? Yeah. I don't know everything it says. I haven't read the whole thing, but I know how important it was, because one of the things it did was give the federal government the authority to examine certain practices in different states that were prohibiting and preventing black people from being able to vote. Like, anybody ever heard of the jelly bean test?
Yes, I have.
There were actually places in different southern states where, in order for a black person to go in and vote, they would have a giant size jar filled with jelly beans. And I'm not talking about a little jar like this. I'm talking about like 5,000, 6,000 jelly beans. And if you could guess the exact number of jelly beans in the jar, which changed, of course, depending on your answer, then you could vote. That was one test. Another test in certain local state court systems where you would go down to the county to vote in the South, was if you could prove, and this would have been, I guess well up until 1965, anytime before that, if you could prove that your great-great-great-great-grandfather voted, then you could vote. Well, guess what? Your great-great-great-great-grandfather and your great-grandfather and sometimes your grandfather had been a slave, so of course they couldn't vote. So they came up with all these crazy tests, and if you could pass those tests, then you could allegedly vote. And so what the Voting Rights Act did was the federal government, the Department of Justice said, no, we're going to look at these laws, and any law that deliberately excludes blacks from voting, we're going to eliminate. That was called the Preclearance Clause. Well, not even 5 years ago, a Supreme Court case eliminated the Preclearance Clause. And so what happened? You had North Carolina, Georgia, and certain other states institute new tests where you could only register to vote like 1 hour in the middle of the day on a Wednesday. And I'm talking about, this is 2018, 17, 16. This is not 1960. Another law in North Carolina eliminated most of the polling places in the African American neighborhoods. So if you could get to a polling place way across town, over the mountain, then you could, this is 2017, 18, 19, not 1960. And so if you don't pay attention, important legislation that I think helps to make our country a more democratic and stronger country is lost. So I forgot what the question, are we post-racial?
Yeah, that's okay.
In some ways we are. We were talking about this last night with Mary Anna and Ariel, that when I look around and I look at the warmth and friendships in this room of all different kinds of people, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, gay, straight, we do have a more open society in many ways now. And that's a very positive thing, because I think when you know somebody, it's much harder to view them as less than you. It's when you live off of stereotypes and misinformation and assumptions about people that we forget the humanity in each of us. So I think in some ways we are post-racial. In other ways, we have to be careful not to lose more ground.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, you high schoolers? Oh, okay, we have one more time for one more question. Then we're gonna come up, present her with a gift, and sing "We Shall Overcome." Teresa, did you get the mic? A young lady, won't you stand up and tell us your name and what grade you're in?
I'm Grace LaFramboise, and I'm a senior. And I have a question. So when Dr. Martin Luther King was advocating for like civil rights and everything, he had like tons of politicians and everything standing behind him. That was until he spoke out against the war in Vietnam. And so can you talk about a little bit about, I guess, how he lost leverage and how he stood for like what he believed in, even though it would mean losing political leverage?
I think that's a great question.
Yes, she's been doing her homework too.
And I can remember this. I think people were more comfortable with Dr. King when he only talked about race. But he began, and I believe as we get closer to 1968 when he was assassinated, to think more globally about economic injustice. That, racial injustice was one form of legal injustice, but there was also economic injustice that made it difficult for people to rise out of generational poverty. They didn't have access to loans for education or for housing, or they were redlined, meaning they were in areas where banks wouldn't loan to them. So there was economic injustice. But then he looked around and he viewed the Vietnam War as unjust, because for a couple of reasons. He felt that the people, this was when the draft was in effect. Anybody know what the draft was? Now, most people in our Army, they volunteer to be in our military service. At the time of the Vietnam War, there was a mandatory draft. So guess what? Where are all my high school students who are 17 and 18? Guess who would have been drafted? So if you look around at your classmates, they would be on their way to Vietnam. And so it was not only rural communities, poorer communities, and minority communities. They were the ones going first because college-educated folks were getting deferments. People of greater income and means and privilege would get deferments, like, oh, I have flat feet, or other reasons for their deferments. And so the people going were the people who were less privileged, and he thought that that was wrong. Plus, he felt that the Vietnamese were being oppressed. Now I'm really going to get into trouble if I start. And that the war was unjust, and that if he was going to be a voice of moral authority and a voice of moral equality, he had to speak out on that as well. And when he was assassinated in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, he went because the workers were striking there. And a lot of people in the civil rights movement felt like, why are you talking about that? Sanitation workers. What does that have to do with racism and racial inequality? And he said, well, injustice anywhere. This is one of my favorite quotes from him, and this is the quote on the front of our courthouse when we renovated it, that we put in 10 years ago. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, because it just starts to erode. And if I can look away at the unfairness of sending our poorest, most vulnerable, or non-people of privilege to fight this war, then how can I be a voice for justice on racial issues in this country? And so I think he was a man of conscience, and he wasn't perfect. There were a lot of allegations of some imperfections in his character, but he tried to do the right thing all the time and for all people. And I think that's one of the things that I admire.
Okay, before we end, I would like to thank Teresa Johnson and Brittany Towns for helping assist me with this program. Yep. Marissa, is Marissa here? Okay, come on up. And we have a gift for you. You won't have to report it, will you? It's just a...
Good afternoon. Chief Justice Blackburne-Rigsby, you are an inspiration to each of us here, and your story echoes the words of Dr. King when he said that we should not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, as Dean McHenry quoted earlier. Our campus, through the leadership of Dean Jefferson and Dean McHenry, strive to reach this goal every day here in VLS. And on behalf of the students, we thank you for attending our annual ceremony.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you. Okay, you know what we used to do at those mass meetings with Dr. King? At the end, we would sing, "We Shall Overcome." Yes. Oh, sure. It's your show.
I forgot to say one quick thing. I remember when, before this became a holiday, Martin Luther King Day became a federal holiday in 1983. And I was a college student, and we marched on the Mall a couple years in a row and we went up to Capitol Hill, and we went to state legislators to make this day a national holiday, and a day of observance, a day to remember him, a day to reflect on him, and a day to recommit ourselves. So I hope that each of you here will recommit yourselves to serving in your community, wherever you are, in your school, in your neighborhood, to do and make this world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna stand, and then I want to show you what we used to do. Okay, look. And we're just gonna sing the verse twice.
Okay.
Okay. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe. Oh, we shall overcome someday. What's the next verse? We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe. We shall overcome someday. What's your next verse? I know I said two.
Live in peace.
We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe. We shall overcome someday. Thank you. This concludes our program. Do a picture. Where's Teresa then with a camera? Oh.
Dean McHenry.
Picture?
Can you do a picture?
Yeah. I'm gonna get my picture. Okay.
Yeah, I told him.